Please be seated. Ambassador Power, welcome to Seton Hall University. Students, friends, and colleagues, welcome. It is a gift to have you all here, to have all of you now, to have all of you together. Moments count. Words count. This morning I received a letter, an old-fashioned letter, with words in a piece of paper, and I cried when I read it. We share words. We make sense of the world through them. We make the world through words. The peace process in Mozambique that I served a lifetime ago came about, among other things, because of few words shared by an old Pope, John the 23rd, a dreaming Pope who said, "Seek what unites, not what divides." Yesterday, in the State of the Union address, President Obama mentioned another Pope, Francis, and I cherish this attitude of paying attention to each other's words. Acceptance requires discipline. Dreams command disciplines. It makes a difference what we say and how we say it. It makes a difference the way we say and to whom we are saying it. It makes a difference when we recognize who is in the conversation and how respectful we hear all voices, seeking them out as we do here with so many refugees coming. Thank you, Ambassador Powers, for suggesting this and arranging this. Seeking them out when they are too distant or too feeble or too sick to be heard in the cacophony of public conversation. There are some who, in the name of fear, want to separate, to punish, and to defend only some. There are others who think that words and moments can liberate, can make the world better, and in the process create conditions for greater freedom for all. I met Ambassador Powers a few years ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, before she was Ambassador Powers, before she published A Problem from Hell, the book on genocide that changed the conversation on mass atrocities in America and globally. Thank you, Ambassador Powers, for those words and for the work on them that followed through the Atrocities Prevention Board and beyond. The School of Diplomacy is an active founding member of the Global Alliance Against Mass Atrocity Crime, GAMAC, the state-led coalition that will gather again in Manila soon. And we are very cognizant of the need for dedicated and effective leadership. Words count, and we heard some important one from President Obama yesterday in the State of the Union speech. The School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall is delighted to enable this conversation in collaboration with the United Nations Association of the US, thank you, Chris, and APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. Our students are engaged in the learning that is making the world. Our great faculty is committed to relevant research and policy. Administration and students' organizations participated actively in organizing this successful welcome. I'm grateful. I'm also grateful for their commitment to make sure that what we hear today will not stay here, but will continue to live in our commitment and creativity. Welcome, Ambassador Powers.
Thank you, Dr. Bartoli, for that introduction and for all the work you've done throughout your career in pursuit of peace in places visible and not so visible. Thank you for that. And a huge thanks to Seton Hall for hosting us all today. The main purpose of this gathering is not to give you all my version of the State of the Union. I have a boss. He's a kind of good speaker. He's a little famous for that and for a few other things. And following him on stage is a very, very bad idea. But before we open it up to take questions and to talk about the state of the world and to engage on issues of foreign policy, I'd like to share briefly with you a more focused look on some of the foreign policy themes that the President spoke to last night, and specifically to share with you a perspective from where I get to sit as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. If you've been following the election coverage lately, as I'm sure many of you have, something you often hear from one part of the field at least is that America's global influence has been in steady decline, in no small part thanks to President Obama. If these voices are to be believed, the United States is seen around the world as weak, disengaged, rudderless. Now, I have a perspective on this. From where I sit, I have a unique vantage point into how other countries view the United States. Because in addition to having the privilege of sitting behind a placard that says the United States of America every day and speaking on behalf of our nation, I also have a lot of opportunities to hear from what the other 192 UN member states think about us, from engaging them in the UN Security Council to negotiating with them on new sanctions or whether to deploy a peacekeeping force, to simply getting to know their diplomats as individuals and to get to know their families in New York. I've also had the chance to meet with a range of people, of course, when I travel abroad on official trips, from refugees to UN peacekeepers, from civil society activists, to the very political leaders that those civil society activists are seeking to hold accountable. And across these encounters, what strikes me is how consistently people around the world look to the United States to lead when it comes to tackling the great problems of our time. If there's one formula for every encounter or one prediction one can make, they're going to be asking the United States to lead and believing that little will happen if the United States does not. Our challenge is not that people around the world lack faith in American leadership. It's, frankly, that they look for America to lead in every single crisis and sometimes believe that because of our strength and our capabilities, that we can solve and fix every problem by ourselves. That can sometimes prove a challenge, as others within the community of nations, within the international community, sometimes aren't willing to pull their weight or to do their fair share. But that's a problem that is hardly born of other countries' belief that America is weak. That's a belief that we can just snap our fingers and remake the world ourselves. These people believe, as so many of us do as well, that America has a unique and indispensable role to play in the world. And I want to just briefly touch upon how I think we can continue to live up to that expectation, keep America safe and strong. And I'd like to draw on 3 points that President Obama made last night. First, today's global challenges are such that we have to rally other nations to our side. Some look at efforts to build coalitions and common cause, again, as a sign of weakness. But just because America is the most powerful nation on earth doesn't mean it is smart or in the interest of the American people or in the interest of the world for the United States to go it alone. We have to get other countries to share the burden, and many of the problems that I'm sure you'll want to engage on here momentarily are ones that just structurally require those coalitions. That even if we tried to do everything ourselves on climate change, for instance, or on terrorism, one country cannot deal with threats that cross borders in the way that modern threats do. The approach that we have taken is one that has allowed us to initially bend and then end the curve of the deadly Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Just a few weeks ago, on December 29th, Guinea was finally declared Ebola-free, making it the last of the 3 countries hardest hit by the epidemic after Liberia and Sierra Leone to get down to 0 cases. Now, more than 11,000 people lost their lives in the Ebola outbreak. It's devastating, that toll, and communities are scarred and survivors are stigmatized to this day. But hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more people might have died if the United States had not catalyzed a global response to stop Ebola's spread. When the world was slow to wake up to the threat that the outbreak posed, we didn't just deploy some 3,000 military personnel, doctors, epidemiologists, logisticians, and development workers to lead the effort on the ground, far more than any other government. We also, these individuals collaborated with communities on the ground. We partnered. We have sought to invest in the capacity of these communities who will ultimately dictate the fate of their nations. And we leverage the commitments that we made to get other countries to come on board. And I can tell you just from being at the United Nations what it meant when President Obama came forward and said, notwithstanding the fact that our military is active in multiple theaters around the world, notwithstanding the fact that for all of us, Ebola is a new phenomenon, one we are struggling even still to understand the precise epidemiology of how it spreads and how it has moved over these last 2 years. Notwithstanding all of that, when the United States stepped up to lead, other countries said, whoa, this is real. Now we've got to think to ourselves, what can we do? How can we help? And you saw that commitment, that initial commitment that the president made in the face of pretty strenuous domestic concern, as you might recall. You saw the effect it had on other countries, as others also stepped up to help build emergency treatment units, to send health workers, to provide basic equipment like plastic bottles and chlorine and SIM cards for the phones so that people who were showing symptoms of Ebola, that information could quickly be shared so that contacts could be traced, and again, the spread could be curbed. When the world needs an all-hands-on-deck effort, America not only does its part, we step up and we lead. And that is the approach we have also taken to destroying the monstrous terrorist group ISIL, as we have marshaled a coalition of 65 countries that is not only confronting the group militarily, but necessarily working together to cut off ISIL's financing, to stop the flow of terrorist fighters from other parts of the world, to counter the spread of the venomous ideology that ISIL has used to attract recruits and to fuel terror. And it is the approach you saw as we led nearly 200 countries in reaching the most ambitious agreement in history to fight climate change, aimed at preserving our majestic planet for generations to come. Second, we pursued a path of principled engagement with governments hostile to the United States. This is something that has really been a hallmark of President Obama's leadership. Now, engaging regimes that are violating international norms or abusing their own people does not mean that we are condoning their behavior, that we are naive about the threats that they pose, that we think that somehow we're going to snap our fingers and they're going to change overnight. Nor does it mean at any point that we become blind to the abuses that they commit. Rather, we believe that we should explore the tools in the toolbox to see which might work in order to bring about improvement in our national security, improvement in the conditions in which citizens abroad have to live in. And diplomacy is a tool in the toolbox. And in the appropriate circumstances, it should be tested. Look at Cuba. For more than 50 years, our efforts to isolate the Castro government actually ended up isolating the United States, providing the regime with a pretext for its repression and an excuse for its shortcomings. Instead of answering to the people, we could just point to the embargo and say, it's the Americans. They're the reason you're struggling in this way. They're the reason things aren't going the way you want for your kids and your grandkids. By restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba, we have taken away the regime's bogeyman. We have strengthened our relationships with other governments across the Americas, and we have actually put ourselves in a better place to help advance the human rights of the Cuban people. Look at Iran, clear-eyed about the dangers of a nuclear-armed Iranian government. We built up a global coalition to impose sanctions, and those sanctions eventually brought the regime to the negotiating table, and those sanctions provided the pressure to keep them at the negotiating table. The result was a nuclear deal that, if implemented, will cut off Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon. Does engagement diminish our concern about the instability that Iran fuels beyond its nuclear program? Of course not. No. Does it mean that we will stop condemning the Cuban government's repression of its own people? Not for 1 minute. Some say it is foolish to engage these regimes. Seeing what we have been able to achieve, though, through principled engagement, we think it would be foolish not to. This brings me to my third and final point. We recognize that one of our greatest strengths and a major reason that the world looks to the United States to lead is our values. Yet lately, we're hearing more and more people calling for actions that would compromise those values or outright contradict those values. And here, let me just give you one example. We are witnessing the largest wave of refugees and displacement since the Second World War, many of whom are fleeing the catastrophic conflict in Syria, where they are caught between a regime that gasses, barrel bombs, and deliberately starves its own people, caught between that on the one hand, and violent extremists who sell women like cattle in markets and murder people just because of their religious preference or because of their ethnicity. That is the world these people are fleeing. And yet some in this country, including some politicians, have called for us to turn away innocent people who are trying to escape these horrors. More than half of America's governors have said they do not want their states to admit refugees from places like Syria. More than half. Others have gone further, arguing that because some people have used religion perversely to justify their acts of terror, we should start using faith to determine who should and should not be admitted to the United States. They say that keeping these others out of America, whether those others are refugees, Muslims, Syrians, or members of some other group, they say it's the only way to keep us safe. But these people misunderstand who we are and what makes us strong. As the president said last night, the world respects us not just for our arsenal. It respects us for our diversity and our openness and the way that we respect every faith. Compromising on those core values has never made America more secure, and it never will. Just look at our history. Name a time when sacrificing our pluralism, our respect for freedom of religion, or any of our other core principles has made this country more secure. It has not. It will not. You cannot think of a time where it has. By turning away refugees, we would lose out on the tremendous contributions that they will make to our societies, that they have made. One of my predecessors as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was Madeleine Albright, a refugee. Google founder Sergey Brin, philanthropist George Soros, another former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, If these stakes do not feel real enough, take a moment to speak with some of the brave individuals and families who are here with us today. Like an Iraqi family I had the privilege of meeting earlier this morning, a young woman in the family had worked for years helping U.S. journalists reporting from Iraq. Eventually, she married an American and moved here with him. As a result, her relatives in Iraq were labeled collaborators by violent extremists, and several were kidnapped and murdered. The young woman's mother, 2 sisters, brother, and her 4 little nieces and nephews lived in constant fear that they would be next. So they applied to come to the United States through a special program that assists people who helped Americans in Iraq. And a few months ago, a number of them were allowed to come to the United States, settling in Brooklyn. Members of that family are here with us today, and out of concern for the safety of their loved ones who are still in Iraq, I will not share their names. But would any of us want to live in a country that would turn away a family like this because of where they are from or because of what they believe? Tariq Ahmad Zafar is also here. He fled Pakistan together with his wife, Arika, and their son, Salik, who is 5 years old, and Newman, who is 3. They had been persecuted for belonging to the Ahmadiyya sect of Islam. Today, they live in Jersey City, where Tariq works at a local department store, and Salik has just started school. Imagine for a moment refusing to take in a family threatened for its beliefs simply because they are Muslim. These are just 2 of a handful of the refugee families who are here today. And I urge you to go out into your communities. These families are everywhere. They are part of the fabric of American life. Those who are here today are accompanied by representatives of several groups who have worked to help people like them when they come to the United States, help settle them once they arrive. It's a big adjustment. Talk to these families. There are a lot of choices in the grocery store in the United States. It's really hard when you don't speak the language. Getting your kids acclimatized into schools, where not only is the language an issue, but even the script in which we write. These are really challenging times, and the organizations who help these families adjust really do God's work. And I tip my hat to them. We have here today the Church World Services, HIAS, Human Rights First, the International Refugee Assistance Project, and we are joined on stage and in the audience by members of several student groups at Seton Hall who've dedicated a whole lot of volunteer hours to advancing America's deepest held principles, such as law school students who have taken up some of these asylum cases pro bono. This is in keeping with the vision and service of Seton Hall's founder, Bishop James Roosevelt Bailey, who found his way to his Catholic faith working with poor immigrants in Harlem in the middle of the 19th century, many of whom had immigrated to the United States from Ireland, as my family did when I was just 9 years old. And it is in keeping with this school's long tradition of embracing people of all faith, ethnicities, and nationalities, including refugees, a spirit reflected in the bumper sticker that I saw tacked to a dean's door when I walked in today that said, "Jesus was a refugee." Surely we can get that bumper sticker around town and around the country. Jesus was a refugee. I want to give a special shout out to Mayor Dominic Stampone of Haladon, who's also here with us today. Where is he? All right. So, Mr. Mayor, he was one of 18 mayors who wrote to President Obama in September saying his community was ready to welcome all refugees. The borough of Haladon also passed a resolution last month affirming it as a place, quote, where all are welcome and where those fleeing persecution may find safe refuge, end quote. Jesus was a refugee. We salute the mayor and the entire Haladon community for their courage, and we know that the more that people open their ears and their hearts and actually get to know these families, we know that more mayors are going to join the mayor of Haladon in sending this message. That is what the vast majority of the American people want. To these individuals, groups, and to all of the members of this community who welcome refugee families, again, I would just say thank you. You represent the proudest of American values and traditions, and our communities are stronger because of the work that you are doing. And to the families like Tariq's, the Iraqi family that I mentioned, my new friends, the Al-Tabawis, who came here from Syria about a month ago, and so many others, we say America welcomes you. Our families welcome your families. It is these values, together with our willingness to use principled diplomacy to engage adversaries, and our willingness to rally multilateral coalitions behind the causes we know to be right, behind the causes we know to be necessary, also for the safety and the security of the American people. These are the values. This is the foreign policy that will allow the United States to continue to lead for generations to come. I thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. David, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Power. Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here at Seton Hall University. My name is David Ushery. I anchor the 5:30 newscast every day. Sometimes I'm mistaken for Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, because of my physique. It's okay if that happened to you. I'm going to use a sports analogy because if you did your due diligence like I did, you know that the ambassador really wanted to be a sports reporter when she was young. She took a detour, but nevertheless,
There's still time.
Yeah, I'm going to play the role of quarterback because you have access to the ambassador, you have your student leaders here, and you have opportunities to ask questions, so I'm going to get out of the way real quickly. The ambassador has to work a little harder with name recognition with my 10-year-old son. I was watching the State of the Union last night, and I don't know if you saw it, but there were quite a number of shots of the ambassador. And yes, I'm an objective reporter, but I knew I was going to be on a stage with her. So I called my son. I said, dude, look, I'm going to be with her tomorrow. He said, great, who is she? I said, she's the ambassador, you know, the UN. She's dealing with a lot of countries. He's like, was she in the most recent Star Wars movie? No, she wasn't. So, Ambassador, we've got some work to do. You're a parent, but nevertheless, they're excited. We're excited to have you. We're going to start with a couple of questions from our student leaders. Then you'll be able to ask questions. I also have some questions that were sent in by social media to the hashtag AskPower. So we have Taylor Kane and Dylan Ashdown. Which one's going first?
All right. On.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, good morning, Ambassador Powers. And on behalf of the School of Diplomacy, thank you for choosing to speak at Seton Hall University this morning. My name is Taylor Kane. I'm a freshman here at the School of Diplomacy. And my question to you is, drawing upon your experiences from Rwanda to the present, what's the difference in the responsibilities between journalists and politicians in keeping the American public engaged and interested in foreign affairs, even if the conflict doesn't initially appear to impact the U.S. and its citizens? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, implicit in your question is my own background. I started as a journalist in my early 20s, soon after I graduated from college, and reported on the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And at the time, you know, the Balkans was something that people thought about as a place where there'd been conflict for hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years. That was the way people talked about it. And part of the challenge that we faced as reporters and as storytellers was to cross that divide and to make readers in the United States and in other countries that were not affected by conflict see all that we as families would have in common with families who were living there in the Balkans. And around the same time that I was a journalist there, the Rwanda genocide was happening, as you mentioned. 800,000 people killed in 100 days. And it was the Hutu and the Tutsi, and, you know, most Americans hadn't really thought of the ethnic dynamics in Rwanda. They had never thought about Rwanda. Rwanda is a very small country in the middle of Africa. Those journalists really struggled. How do you make the American people believe that's what's happening in Rwanda matters to them in their daily lives? And sometimes we succeeded. I think we had more success in the Balkans eventually. In part, the Cold War had just ended, and people were interested in whether Europe could come together, and this was a horrible conflict that seemed to be at odds with some of the hope that the fall of the Berlin Wall had brought about. In part, the Olympics had been held in Sarajevo, the very place that was being ravaged by war. So people had memories. They were more oriented around what was happening there. In truth, people in the Balkans looked more like your average American than people in Rwanda did, and so maybe that was a factor. But either way, eventually we succeeded, I think, in crossing the divide and in convincing the American people that the people who were being targeted mattered to them, and that the spread of conflict from the Balkans was something that would imperil U.S. national security. But we did it by humanizing what was happening. And I think flashing forward to today, as a foreign policy maker, as part of President Obama's cabinet, and as someone representing the United States, trying to tell the story of what is happening in Madaya, Syria, where people are being starved to death by the Assad regime, trying to tell people why refugees should be admitted to this country and why our communities should welcome them. It's all about still finding those commonalities and making people feel as though what is true, which is that our security is linked. Not only is our humanity linked, not only do we have a common humanity, you know, getting to know the Al-Tabawi family, and their 3-year-old daughter is here, Rama. I have a 3-year-old daughter named Rian. You know, we're just mothers of 3-year-olds trying to figure out how to make sure our kids grow up and have opportunities. And in the case of a family from Syria, just that they're safe, just that they live to see their 4th birthday. That's what those families are going. Imagine if that was your family. But you've got to find a way to cross these divides, because, you know, bad news is not something that people love reading and love engaging on. It makes us feel bad, makes us feel guilty sometimes, it makes us feel powerless. So trying to find the words and the stories to cross those divides, to make the American people feel connected to families that they've never met and that they probably will never meet, and also trying to look around a corner and see the extent to which conflicts come back to roost and do affect our national security, and why we have an interest, as well as, again, the values that should connect us with these communities.
Ambassador Power won a Pulitzer Prize for a book about genocide. It got the attention of a young senator named Barack Obama, and since that time, she has been able to advise him on foreign affairs. Taylor.
Ambassador, thank you again for coming to speak to us at the school. We are all incredibly honored. My name is Dylan Ashdown, and I'm a second-year graduate student here at the School of Diplomacy and International Relation. My question to you is, what do you consider to be your greatest accomplishment in your career in public service?
My greatest accomplishment in life, which is not what you asked, is my 6-year-old and my 3-year-old, and it's not even close. So nothing I do professionally will ever compete with that. And, you know, I worked alone my whole career before I met Senator Obama. I had always been writing, you know, in my little apartment or out in the world, taking these trips to these places where conflict was happening or people were being targeted. And the most amazing part about joining Senator Obama's office initially, and then the campaign, and then the White House, and now being part of his foreign policy team, is the team the way the team kind of comes together. And I am a big sports fan, and it's a lot like baseball, where, every now and then, it's like most of baseball. Take away the home run, every other form of scoring requires someone else to do something. And so I think what I would say in response on the Obama administration and its foreign policy, I think some of the things I mentioned in my remarks today, the opening with Cuba is historic. The prospect of dismantling Iran's nuclear program, which is happening as we sit here. They are working to take out centrifuges and to remove nuclear material. To be able to achieve that without conflict, we have invested mightily in UN peacekeeping, which is a flawed enterprise. But if you think of the number of places, there are now 100,000 peacekeepers around the world. These are people who are leaving their families. They don't get to come home to parades, right? No one in their country really knows whether they're in the Central African Republic, they're in South Sudan, like what are they doing out there? And yet they go, and often they don't come home. And the United States has long funded peacekeeping, but we had never invested as much as this administration has invested. And President Obama just managed to mobilize commitments from countries within the UN to dedicate another 50,000 troops to peacekeeping, which means that there'll be a much bigger supply of troops to draw from when there is an emergency and when it's time to deploy, and hopefully we can get them in there more quickly so that they do a better job of protecting people. And also when peacekeepers do terrible things, which happens, sexual abuse reports are rampant, particularly in the Central African Republic, but in other missions, then there can be the kind of accountability that is urgently overdue, because there's then a pool of peacekeepers that one can draw from. Those who are alleged to be committing these acts can be sent home. They need to be held accountable. And if they're not held accountable, that country shouldn't be able to send more peacekeepers into places where these people are so vulnerable. So I think, again, some of the achievements that the president spoke to last night, but in general, investing in the multilateral architecture so that we see multilateral tools as our capabilities. Those are America's capabilities, even if it's not us who are doing the peacekeeping. These are the kinds of things that are helping avert conflict today so it doesn't come home to roost, and we're not in a situation where we have to think about using military force ourselves. And trying to prevent conflict at an earlier stage, very important.
I'm going to ask people now, if you have questions, please make your way to the microphone. This is an opportunity to ask the ambassador a question. Housekeeping for me, John, you're keeping me honest on time, correct? All right, great, because I don't want to run over ambassador's schedule. As you make your way there, I want to dovetail off Taylor's question, Ambassador, real quick. The president was reflective last night in many ways, and as you're reflective in this final year of the administration, are there areas where you feel still frustrated or challenging? We believe the Obama administration was a little frustrated with the Israel-Palestine issue, and I think that you were on your way to Israel when the North Korea testing happened last week. How would you characterize that and where that stands right now?
Well, let me, if I can broaden as well, because your question is a great one. I think that I spent a fair amount of time today talking about displacement and refugees. One of the reasons that we have so many refugees is that conflicts today are not ending. And it's a phenomenon. I mean, really, even just when I cut my teeth in the Balkans as a journalist, conflicts were lasting, sometimes around under 10 years. And now they're up at 19 years average and counting. And it means that people are staying displaced longer. Kids are out of school. And that means that's going to be a source of instability in the long term. So when you take the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where, again, we are very eager to see a negotiated pathway to a two-state solution. It has to happen. It's in the interests of the security of everyone in the region, the dignity of individuals living in the region. For as long as that doesn't happen, security gets worse. We see a spate of killings now, stabbings and killings on both sides that it's just heartbreaking for all of the families who are involved and destabilizing. And these escalatory cycles continue unless you get at the root causes and unless a political settlement is achieved. I've talked about Syria. absolutely has to be a political solution. We can take more refugees. We must take more refugees. But there are 11 million people displaced by that conflict. And every day more are being displaced by the Russian airstrikes and by ISIL's terror and the Syrian regime's terror that it inflicts on its people. So a political solution is at the heart of what is needed for all of the conflicts that are themselves producing displacement. And you ask any of these families, yes, they are here, and all of them would be the first to say how grateful they are and how blessed they are. But what they wouldn't do to never have been displaced in the first place, or to have the choice to be able to go back home or not, or to be able to stay in this great country. That's the choice we have to work to give even those families who've come to this country, to ensure that the conditions exist where they come from, where that choice is available to them, or where they're not waking up in the middle of the night thinking about their families who are still left behind. As all of these individuals who are here today are tormented by the risks that those who are still living in Syria or in Iraq or are persecuted because of their religion in other parts of the world or because of their ethnicity. And so we've got to deal with the root causes. And that, if you ask me what keeps me up at night, it's the need to find political solutions, not only to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the Yemen conflict, to the Syrian conflict. All across Africa, the same dynamics exist. So we have our work cut out for us, and that's why diplomacy is so important, and investing in that tool in the toolbox is so key.
Please tell us your name and your question.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, there you go.
I'm Noelle Sorge, a freshman in the School of Diplomacy here. On behalf of the school, I would just like to thank you for being here this morning. My question for you is, with the adoption of Resolution 2170 on the condemnation of ISIL and Obama's reference to ISIL last night, do you think that there's any more opportunity on further multilateral cooperation against ISIL?
Thank you, and I'll try to be briefer in my responses so we can hear from everybody. Look, the 65-nation coalition is operating militarily and has taken back 30 to 40% of the territory that ISIL has held in Iraq and in Syria. And ISIL is feeling the heat. But it is really important to think about what ISIL is and how it has taken fuel. It has taken fuel, quite literally taken fuel, and taken over oil fields and actually sold those oil fields. We have to stop that resource revenue generating stream that ISIL has managed over these years. So this financial component, cutting off their access to finance, is critical. Social media, making sure that people who have survived ISIL tell their stories, so that this notion that it's a noble utopian project that is being used to recruit people who then get, in effect, imprisoned by ISIL once they actually show up, those messages have to get out. And other countries, again, need to dedicate more trainers, more money to deal with the humanitarian effects of ISIL. But if you take out any one strand of the response or any one line of effort, you can't succeed. And what's really going to be important is that forces on the ground are in a position to take back territory and to hold it and to allow families to return to it. And that requires money, of course, but it also requires, in the case of Iraq, the Sunni to be empowered and to be able to protect their own community. In the case of Syria, it requires local forces who are trusted by the community to be part of the solution on the back end. And that's one of the many complexities associated with the conflict. So again, it's not a question of, as the president said last night, carpet bombing and then ISIL goes away. That's not going to solve the problem for anybody. Who's going to take the town the next day? Who's going to deal with the fact that when civilians are killed, that can alienate families and people can grow radicalized by harm inflicted by outsiders. You got to be extremely careful in dealing with the complexity of a conflict like this. But again, it's heartening that so many countries want to be part of this coalition, and it's very heartening to see territorially how ISIL's gains are slipping and its senior leadership people are being taken off the battlefield every day.
Thank you.
Foreign affairs, the #1 topic tweeted during the President's State of the Union last night. Guys, here's what we're going to do, because sometimes the ambassador can kind of coalesce her answers. So we're going to take 3 questions at a time. Say your name for 3 of you, say your question, and then we'll deal with them that way to get through more of them, okay?
Great.
Good morning, Ambassador Power. Welcome to Seton Hall. My name is Vincent Maraska, and I'm a 3rd-year student at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. On March 19, 2014, during a Security Council meeting, you stated, quote, "The Russian ambassadors showed more imagination than Tolstoy and Chekhov," end quote. So can you tell us, based on your statement, how can a diplomat engage in a constructive dialogue with other UN member states when there's a plausibility that some of the statements are likely to be interpreted as offensive to one's cultural heritage?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Sir, next we're going to combine them, or try to.
Thank you, Ambassador Power. Thank you for your important comments today. My name is Shaw Drake. I work for Human Rights First here in New York. And I have 2 brief questions. First, how many Syrian refugees is the administration currently seeking to resettle? And second, do you feel that the current immigration raids targeting Central American families here in the United States has hindered your ability to urge your counterparts to take action to address the broader global refugee crisis? Thanks.
All right, those are 3, Ambassador. Maybe you want to take those. So one, I guess, is on dialogue, and
Great.
then those 2.
Great. And even though I'm, again, being too loquacious with my responses, I want to encourage students also to come up, like the students up on the stage and the first gentleman. So I think the first question is, in effect, about how to maintain relationships with one's colleagues when one ends up sometimes in pitched battle with them in highly public ways. And that's certainly something that has happened over the last couple of years between me and my Russian counterpart. For every exchange like the one that was quoted, where I noted that his comments were more fictitious than those of Chekhov and Tolstoy, we also managed to work together on UN peacekeeping in Africa, on implementation of the Iran nuclear deal. So what's really important is to keep professional relationship going, to call a spade when you see it, but also to make clear that our objective is collective security action. And no one wants confrontation, but you also have to call it like you see it and not pull back because you want to make progress in one area. You know, there are citizens around the world in all countries who rely on the United States to stand up for them and to, again, employ the tools we have in the toolbox. So you just got to walk and chew gum at the same time, and that's something I've grown accustomed to doing and think it's actually kind of an amazing feature of the diplomatic community, the way in which people are able to move on from one to the next. On the second question, our objective in 2016 in terms of Syrian refugees specifically is to admit 10,000 Syrians and 85,000 refugees overall, and then to move next year as soon as we can to be able to admit 100,000 refugees overall. We need to do better. We know we need to do better. We also need to make sure that the process is one that continues to look out for the highest standards in terms of the security of the American people, to make sure that the screening is sufficient, because we really do believe that we can achieve both our objectives at once. First and foremost, as the President said last night, keeping the American people safe, but also ensuring that America lives up to its values and is a beacon where people like the families who are gathered here today can be resettled and can be integrated into our communities. And in terms of the Central American migrants and the unaccompanied children, I think what's really important about the flood of people into this country is that they be granted a process to ensure that their cases, that their histories, that what they're fleeing from is adjudicated, and that we are hearing them out to know whether or not, in fact, they are refugees coming to this country, like some of those gathered here today. And that process is something that each one of them will get to go through. Many people have come to this country and have been absorbed, as you know, and we are now, I think Secretary Kerry, in fact, will announce today that we are going to begin to start working with the UN in the countries of origin where there's often horrific violence that these individuals are fleeing, to ensure that their cases can be adjudicated on the front end so they don't have to, entrust their fates, just as so many Syrians have done in these smugglers who do not have their best interests at heart. And so we want to try to deter as best we can these extremely dangerous journeys that very, very young people are taking, and families, again, that are sometimes fleeing great peril. The last thing they should have to do is face peril in their own country and then face peril along the journey. So hopefully moving the UN into the countries in question where this adjudication can take place earlier will mitigate some of the risks. And I think that our platform for leadership on issues related to refugees and migration, as the largest humanitarian donor and as a country that's taken more refugees, I think, than the rest of the world, has resettled more refugees than the rest of the world combined, we're looked to as a leader in this realm.
Thank you. My name is Jean Krasno, and thank you so much, Ambassador Power, for coming and sharing your thoughts with the academic community. I teach courses on the United Nations at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at City College, and I was very pleased to be invited here today. So thank you. My question is this. In this year, 2016, the UN will be making a very, very important decision, and that is to elect a new Secretary General of the UN to replace Ban Ki-moon when he steps down at the end of the year. And there is a movement now growing to have a woman be selected to lead the organization. And the United States plays a very important role at the UN and in this process on the Security Council and so forth. So I would be very interested to hear your perspective on whether the UN and the member states are ready to elect a woman.
Thank you so much. Maybe we'll take a good few here so we can try to...
Yep, and remember to try to keep them as brief as possible so we can get more questions.
Sure thing. My name is Adam Bergdorf. I'm a graduate or alumni of the graduate program of diplomacy here at Seton Hall. And I have a question regarding protection of cultural heritage. Recently, the Security Council passed a resolution prohibiting trade in cultural heritage from Iraq and Syria to help prevent ISIS funding. Do you see any future roles of the Security Council in helping to protect immovable cultural heritage that is, of course, being destroyed throughout the region?
Thank you. And one more, ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Power. My name is Huda Shanawani. I'm the Syrian American Council President of New Jersey. You've answered almost everything that was on my mind, whether in regards to the barrel bombs, to the no-fly zone, the one thing that you did not touch on. What can we as Americans do to relieve this crisis in Syria? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to add one more ambassador right here. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Hello. My name is Priscilla Garces, and I am an alumni from the Seton Hall School of Diplomacy. And my question is, how will the next election influence foreign policy leadership in the U.S.?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay, let me just take these in order, and again, try to be as brief as I can be. I'll take the last question first. Look, I think that you hear pretty different visions articulated by different candidates across the political spectrum. So I'm not going to get into domestic politics. That's definitely far afield from my line of work. But I think what's really important is that we recognize just how tied America's national security is to our ability to mobilize other countries. And, you know, one of the issues related to some of these comments on, you know, Muslims shouldn't be allowed into this country or this or that, is there's no way we defeat ISIL without our Muslim partners, right? By definition. I mean, these countries are, you know, countries where these kinds of comments are not going to go over well. And these are our partners. These are people we want to be involved in sharing intelligence with us. These are the local partners on the ground who will need to move into these communities, who are fighting on the ground terrorists who seek to do not only their own communities harm, but seek to do the United States and the American people harm. So it's really important to understand that national security should come first, which everyone agrees, but one has to think about what are the means to achieve our security and to promote our security, and alienating the very people who we need to partner with is not a route to promoting our national security. And it wouldn't be a route at the UN to building the kinds of coalitions one needs, whether on trade or on Ebola or on HIV/AIDS or on ending poverty or on climate or on peacekeeping. You know, you have to take other countries' interests and perspectives into account, at least as you think through how best to promote your security. In terms of Syria and what the American people can do, I think, you know, some of the examples that we've encountered in our own communities in terms of welcoming Syrians to this country is just one small way. You know, engaging one of the humanitarian organizations that are represented here today and seeing how you might volunteer, or whether some of the families, whether they come from Syria or come from Burma or from Iraq or from Pakistan or Eritrea. I mean, people are coming every day into our communities, and as I said, it's a challenging adjustment at the beginning. I think what the Syrian American Medical Society have done is remarkable. The bravery and the dedication of people involved in your network to try to get medicines, to even deploy doctors into the most dangerous parts of Syria is extremely important. And you know, already we have given close to $5 billion in humanitarian aid for the Syrian people, making sure that we retain that kind of domestic political support to contribute in that way, but much more importantly, because ultimately that will just deal with symptoms of the conflict, to be willing to support whatever investments we have to make in the diplomatic track, and once a political agreement is secured, which is still a ways off, but nonetheless being willing to invest in that and provide resources to ensure that we could lock down any agreement or even any local ceasefire that could be achieved en route to that. On cultural heritage, I don't really have a lot to say beyond that we need to share intelligence. We need to defeat ISIL, which is the leading culprit now of destroying cultural heritage. And so the means to dealing, that is one of many symptoms of the rise of this monstrous organization, and they have to be defeated for the sake of in order to stop what they're doing to religious minorities, in order to stop what they're doing to their own communities, in order to stop the threat that they pose to us. And their trade in cultural artifacts is yet one more reason, and their destruction of Syria and Iraq's tremendous cultural heritage, again, is a reason why the coalition's campaign is so important. And then finally, on a woman Secretary General, the UN has existed 70 years. It is peculiar that a woman Secretary General has not taken the helm before now. We are looking at a large pool of candidates, only a few of whom have put themselves forward as formal candidates, and so it's very hard to know who the pool will be. But when I was president of the Security Council in December, which is just a rotating presidency, every month someone new is president, I joined with the President of the General Assembly in sending out a letter to encourage candidates to apply, and very specifically that letter referenced the importance of women candidates throwing their hats in the ring. And so, again, one can't speculate who's going to emerge in this pool, but we certainly agree that there should be lots of capable women leaders around the world who should be part of this process. And we're, again, very excited about the year that lies ahead in order to try to choose the best possible Secretary General at such an important time for that role.
And Ambassador, I'm sorry, did you say this? There's certain, they can't be from the United States or the Security Council members, is that right? So
Correct, yes. The presumption,
it won't be Samantha Power is what we were going
certainly,
for.
Sorry, yes, that was not a, yes.
Okay.
The presumption is right now that it is likely to be Eastern Europe, that the candidates will come from there. But there are many people who are, I think, considering throwing their hats in the ring from other regions. And so the Security Council will need to come together and agree upon a candidate. And we obviously don't, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, haven't always seen leadership of the UN exactly the same way. And so it'll be probably a lively diplomatic process to achieve consensus.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I understand, Ambassador, your schedule now is tightening. So that was going to be the last response there. I apologize to you, but please join me in giving a hand to Ambassador Power. And of course, thank you to Seton Hall University and this great school of international. Thank you all on behalf of NBC New York. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks specifically to the refugees and those who have helped get them resettled. And thank you to Seton Hall again. Really appreciate it. Thank you.